Good afternoon. My name is Helle Wilstrup, and I am a professor at the Department of Gender Studies. And I am delighted to welcome Professor Jyoti Puri, who will give a talk on unmaking sexual states, anti-sodomy law and racialization in India. And Jyoti Puri, she is professor in sociology and chair at the Department of Sociology at the Simmons College of Arts and Sciences in Boston, in the US. And Professor Puri is an interdisciplinary scholar, which we like here, right? In her research, she applies postcolonial feminist theory and queer studies to provide thought-provoking and critical research on the intricate intersections between nation-state power, nationalism, racism, and sexuality in the Indian context. And as an expert on Foucault, she is actually a co-editor of the International Journal for Foucault Studies. Professor Puri unravels state monitoring and governing of corporal subjects as also configuring in sexualized and racialized compositions in India and beyond. So she is thus the author of the book Woman, Body and Design in Postcolonial India and the book entitled Encountering Nationalism. Professor Puri is currently working on a book with the title Sexual States, Governance and Antisodomy Law in India's Present. The book is under contract with Duke University.
It just came out.
It just came out, and I think this is the book which would, from which we will draw today when we are going to present on the criminalization of homosexuality in India.
Thank you very much. I would really like to begin by thanking Helle for having me here, to Sasnet, all of you for inviting me, and the rest of you for being here. And also, I haven't had a chance to meet Andreas and Camilla and Melina. There are a lot of people who sort of help coordinate your trip and make a visit possible. So my warm regards to you all. As Helle said, I'm actually presenting out of a piece out of my new book, which just came out in February through Duke. And as she was alluding, this is a book in which is tracking the struggle to decriminalize homosexuality in the Indian context, which is still unfolding. But the basics of it actually became clear to me because my focus was on the state in a large degree, and I'll talk more about this as we go. And the piece that I want to talk about in particular today relates to policing of the anti-sodomy law. Which is called Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. So I'll be talking about sort of, as I said, Section 377, which is the anti-sodomy law. And the reason I also picked this particular piece is because it relates to some of the work that I am doing, which has to do with juxtaposing policing of gender, sexual minorities within the Indian context, and some of the violence policing and the violence that has been going on in the United States. So if people are interested about that, we can certainly talk about it in the discussion section. So to just introduce this a little bit and to set the stage for the talk, the premise of my book, Sexual States, is really trying to push back against the conventional wisdom that states regulate sexuality. We're very familiar with this argument that states regulate sexuality in various dimensions, right? And what I end up doing in this book is actually arguing the opposite, in that the regulation of sexuality actually helps constitute states. And for this, I'm drawing on post-structuralist literature on states, feminist literature, feminist postcolonial theory, queer of color critique, so on and so forth, to really make the argument that the regulation of sexuality, its management, its control, its the preoccupation with it that states often have, is really helping not only constitute states, but also justify them and to make them appear as if they are enduring, indispensable, and separate from society. So this very idea that there is something called the state which stands apart from society, and that it is absolutely necessary because if states do not regulate the social, it would mean social chaos, social disorder. So that very premise, that regulating sexuality is actually helping justify, rationalize the continued presence of states and this very idea of the state as absolutely indispensable. So that, in a nutshell, is the argument that I'm making in this book. And the argument was inspired as I was doing ethnography and tracking the struggle to decriminalize homosexuality. So one aspect of the research was to work to sort of to look at how the struggle was unfolding, the legal aspects, why did it end up being law, why the focus on law, etc., etc. The other aspect was to do work among state institutions and agencies. In particular, the state institutions and agencies that were named in the original effort to decriminalize homosexuality. So the police, the Ministry of Home Affairs, the Union Government of India, sort of, a number of agencies and institutions were named. So I started doing ethnography around those. And really the question was, how is this law, which really symbolizes injustice, which appears to symbolize persecution in a lot of ways, how is this law, how does it actually work on the ground, so to speak, on the day-to-day, in quotidian life? How is it used? Right? What are the sort of the governmental lives of this law? And part of the reason was that one of the paradoxes around this law has always been that at the higher court levels, there are very few cases. And for the most part, it appears that the law is used as a threat, as a symbol, as potential. And we don't really know at the lower court levels, because that would mean literally going from court to court to court around the country to gather that kind of data. But with the higher courts where we have the data, there are very few cases in about the 150-year history of the law. So that's sort of a little bit of the backdrop. And the two things that I want to note over here before I go on to the talk is that what started to emerge is that as far as sexual and gender minorities are concerned, Section 377, the Antisodomy Law, is not the only law to impact them. In some ways, I would argue it actually has lesser impact compared to other laws. Right? So this, in some ways, what I'm gesturing to is I'm troubling this kind of focus on the anti-sodomy law to the exclusion of other kinds of laws that are impacting sexual and gender minorities. And the second point that I would make over here is that sexual and gender minorities are not the only people to be impacted by Section 377. So in one aspect we know that it impacts, the law is actually used to prosecute child sexual assault right up till 2012, right? That's how the law was actually used. So that's sort of one group, but what I'm gesturing to, and you'll start to see it in this piece, that it's not people who we would think of who are, gay identified or queer or hijra, or people who would sort of fall within this kind of queer sexual gender minority category. But in fact, that the reach of the law of 377 extends beyond that. So with that caveat, what I'd like to turn to now is the piece around policing, how this law was policed. Nothing identifies the state with coercion and violence than the police and the military. The foremost discourse on civilian police is one of violence. Excessive, ongoing, exhibitionist, spectral, and routine. This not without good reason. The police is routinely accused of causing harm and injury and harassing sexual and gender minorities. While this violence has been documented, institutional analyses of the police are harder to find. Indeed, the Indian police is among the most opaque institutions of the state. What remains unclear is how those who police understand laws such as Section 377, their role in its enforcement, and the use and abuse of law. The two group discussions around which this talk is developed present a rich, complex, and disturbing archive of the structures of meaning that circulate among police constables and those in more senior positions. I stepped to the front of the room to face 25 police constables and introduce myself as someone who teaches and researches in the area of sexuality. I'm interested in what they know about Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code and how they enforce it. It's to do with unnatural sex. Any kind of unnatural sex involving animals, dead bodies, chime a few constables. In the case of an old man trying to have sex with a young girl, they speak to Section 377 easily and participate in the ensuing discussion on the criminal law. I asked the 25 constables for cases that they have encountered related to 377. The examples pour fast and freely. An old man raped a young boy and he came to the police. A Muslim couple where the wife did not want anal sex and filed a complaint against the husband. It happens more among Mohammedans. One constable asserts informatively, casually in Hindi. Manjeet, a turban-wearing Sikh, and I gather most of you are part of Sasnet, so you're aware Sikhs are another religious group within, primarily within India. Manjeet, a turban-wearing Sikh who just finished conducting an HIV/AIDS sensitization session with a constable, reproves the constable immediately, saying firmly but kindly that such remarks shouldn't be made about any community. किसी community के बारे में ऐसा नहीं कहना चाहिए. Without missing a beat, the constable responds, "Your community is the second one where it happens the most." उसके बाद आपकी community में सबसे ज़्यादा होता है. Laughter explodes among the constables. None of them challenges either statements. The constable adds in English, "Don't mind, please," and then in Hindi, "I say what I have seen." The constable's assertion that the crime of unnatural sex happens more among Muslims and Sikhs is a stunning displacement of sexual crimes onto religious cultural communities. This association between Muslims and unnatural sex was reinforced time and time again in conversations with police constables in New Delhi. The use of the term Mohammedans over alternatives such as Muslims deepens the distance between him as a constable and to those he refers. Mohammedans is an archaic term used by the British to describe the followers of Islam and was commonplace in colonial India. The scathing connotations of the constable's statement are exacerbated by the ensuing laughter in the room. That these ideologies and sentiments are not limited to constables became clear in the second group discussion with those higher up in the chain of command, the middle rung of the police. More than 45 heads of police stations and police inspectors gathered for a training session on gender sensitization. So this is the second group. As this discussion turns to same-sex sexualities in Section 377, many of the policemen repeatedly and emphatically insist that most crimes are committed by Muslims. As a group, they are resolute in their beliefs that most crimes under 377, and indeed most crimes in general, are committed by those who are Muslim. Some are quiet, but others chorus. Most unnatural crimes are committed by Muslim community. I have seen that this happens more among Muslim people. Most complaints on 377 are about these people. No one disagrees. One of the two women in the group openly concurs in Hindi. "Madam, I too have seen this." Non-Hindu identified members of the audience listen quietly to these vehement charges against a minority group, perhaps cognizant of its explosiveness. And the reason I know that some of them were not, at least a few of them were not Hindu, is there was, at least one of them was a Sikh wearing a turban. I present the counter-arguments that Muslims do not and could not account for the bulk of crimes in a country with more than 84% Hindus. While some remain quiet, others disagree. Eventually, the discussion tapers off inconclusively and unsatisfactorily, with some policemen obviously restless as the allotted time comes to an end. In the Indian context, responses of members of Delhi police are likely to be imputed to communalism. That is to say, the mostly male Hindu police is prejudiced against Muslims and Sikh communities because of religious sectarianism. Rooted in British colonial politics and coming into usage by the 1920s, the term communalism continues to be widely used in India to represent religion-based sectarian differences as well as mutual hostilities and prejudices. So for example, routinely when there are tensions between Hindus and Muslims, or Muslims and Sikhs, or Hindus and Sikhs, we explain that as communalism. Since the majority of Delhi police is constituted by Hindu Jats, an ethnic group from the neighboring state of Haryana, prejudicial associations of homosexual crimes with Muslims and Sikhs then could be seen as being communalist. But notwithstanding its history, the discourse of communalism is increasingly inadequate for such responses by the police. In his reflections on the history of communal discourse, Gyanendra Pandey notes that the term communalism persists despite its declining relevance in the Indian context, because it serves as a shared language for discussion, but also because of intellectual inertia. This language is less and less useful to the persistence of routine and remarkable forms of violence in which members of some minority communities, especially Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, and Dalits, are grievously hurt by instigations of majoritarian Hindu groups with the implicit and explicit collusion of the state. It must be why terms such as riots, communal violence, and such are repeatedly put within scare quotes, for they are grossly inadequate to describe violence in which the losses of life, livelihood, religious cultural autonomy, and property are disproportionately borne by minority communities. Neither does the term communalism help understand the institutionalization of socioeconomic inequalities and discriminations that are faced by some minority communities. The Sachar Committee report on the social, economic, and educational status of the Muslim community in India captures the widespread and disproportionate gaps in educational attainment, income, bank credit, high-level jobs in the state, among others, for Muslim groups across 13 states, as well as their perceptions and experiences of discrimination. Increasingly, in lieu of communalism, a grammar of majorities and minorities has come to prevail, and terms such as riots are being replaced by pogroms and genocides. As Rustam Barucha notes, it becomes increasingly difficult to seek academic solace in communalism while the exclusion of Muslims escalates from a racism of domination to a racism of extermination. What is needed then is a theory of race and racialization in India's present to locate the insistence by members of the Delhi police that unnatural sex crimes are mostly committed by Muslims and to a lesser extent by Sikhs. The problem, however, is that it has been a strongly held approach, if not an articulated belief, that race ought to be reserved for the colonial context, and it does not belong analytically within the contemporary Indian context. Racial difference has been primarily conceptualized as colonial difference between Europeans and Indians, or whites and browns. Stated simply, the reluctance to use the analytics of race and racialization in India's present is because Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and other religious minority groups are not phenotypically different. However, to see race as phenotypic difference is to engage a particular genealogy of race thinking. If communalism is seen as distinctively or exceptionally South Asian, then race has been of Euro-American provenance. Even though there are multiple trajectories of race, racial classifications, and racial discourses, race in its Euro-American genealogy has come to be about differences written on the body. As Paul Gilroy argues, it has been about the discourses and practices of color, face, hair, skin, and more. Gilroy suggests in his discussion of Frantz Fanon's notion of epidermalization that it is about a historically specific system that makes bodies intelligible by endowing them with qualities of color. While epidermalization may constitute one strand of Euro-American race thinking, racist projections are not always decipherable on the body. What ties together culturally and historically different trajectories of race are understandings that difference is unequal and naturally occurring. That is, it is inheritable. In other words, we can think of social difference as being racialized when groups and communities are not only seen as different and unequal, but that inequality is rationalized as natural, inheritable, and enduring. The trajectory of racism that I'm considering here is not intelligible through phenotypic differences, but rather through cultural discourses of blood, psyche, and sinew. In India's present, the community of religion is seen as natural formation. The terrain through which difference is produced and marked is undoubtedly religious cultural, even as its rationalizations draw strength from the realm of nature. So what I'm arguing over here is not the sort of against this kind of phenotypic trajectory of understanding race, right? And understanding it in its cultural iterations. And what I'm suggesting over here is that what marks these discourses of race and racialization is this idea that some things are naturally occurring. That there is, even though we know religion occurs within the cultural terrain, but the way it is actually talked about as if there is something natural about it, right? And that that is being passed from generation to generation. In Hindu majoritarian discourses, Muslims are consistently cast as both alien outsiders, the descendants of Mughal invaders who proselytized Islam, as well as internal outsiders, the lower caste Hindus who converted to Islam. In either case, they are constantly asked to prove allegiance to the Hinduized nation. Racism is sustained through discourses of hygiene, diet, especially meat eating, representations of polygamy, high population growth rates, and fanaticism. For example, in his ethnography of the 2002 genocide of Muslims in Gujarat, Parvez Qasim Fashandi notes how meat eating, excessive sexual appetites, especially for Hindu young women, and excessive violence are consistently imputed to Muslims by majoritarian Hindus. The Hindu right has fanned fears about an explosive fertility rate among Muslims, pejoratively called the Muslim growth rate. If the myth of the oversexed Muslim man and his overfertile Muslim wife or wives echoes among majoritarian Hindus and other minority groups, then the circumcised penis circulates as the embodiment of a community and its otherness. And the caveat over here is that Hindus and Sikhs are not circumcised, the men are not circumcised, so that sort of becomes a marker of the racial difference. Thus, in Hindu majoritarian discourses, religious differences are projections of what are presumed to be innate, enduring, and inheritable traits. The racialization of Sikhs in India's past and present is qualitatively and historically different compared to Muslims. And even though it reverberates at the national level, it is also peculiarly a product of Delhi as site of governance and bloody, calculated vengeance. The 1984 pogrom against Sikhs in Delhi, in the aftermath of the assassination of then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi by her Sikh bodyguards, produced a minority that had been long in the making. Much like the genocide against Muslims in Gujarat, the terror inflicted against Sikhs was methodically executed and the police either deliberately did not intervene while the murderous violence raged for 3 days, or in some cases participated in it. In the following years, until the end of the 1990s, a protracted struggle to constitute a sovereign Sikh state was brutally suppressed through military and police violence. In her fieldwork in Delhi during and in the aftermath of the 1984 pogrom, Veena Das details both the changing self-representations of Sikhs and of dominant Hindu representation of them. Das crystallizes Hindu understanding of Sikh traits as the following: that Sikhs are loyal only to their religion, fanatic to the point of madness, capable of betraying the closest trust, they are naturally aggressive, attracted to violence, and incapable of observing normal social constraints. As a result of the events of 1984 and the struggle for a sovereign state, Sikhs were recast in the national imaginary as an anti-national minority, terrorists and religious separatists, the ghosts of which persist to date. Delhi police involvement in the 84 pogrom and broader shift in dominant perceptions and strengthening of these racist stereotypes of Sikhs have left their imprints on the constables in this discussion group. Cultural discourses are intensified by institutional imbalances, namely the declining representation of Sikhs in the Delhi police. So historically what happened was that Sikhs served in the military and in the police in much higher numbers than actually exist. And their share of the population is no more than about 2% of the population, so it's a very small group. But in 1991, they constituted an impressive 21% of the Delhi police. After 1984, the numbers have been dwindling dramatically, and there is a rumor of a ban against Sikh recruitment in the Delhi police. Indeed, in the numerous visits to police stations and police headquarters in Delhi, one is hard-pressed to find turban-wearing Sikhs. To grapple with constables' discourse on sexuality and criminality, I see race as a methodological tool through which to connect biologies on the surface with cultural discourses of innateness. Etienne Balibar analyzes comparable forms of racism, such as anti-Semitism, as culturalist racism, the kind that does not rely on the pseudo-biological concept of race as its driving force. Although bodily stigmata play a role, it is as signs of a deep psychology, as signs of a spiritual inheritance, rather than a biological hereditary, according to him. My purpose here is not to collapse the nuances between representations of race that are overtly about biology. So for example, apparent phenotypic differences between whites and browns, and the ones that essentialize cultural qualities, such as the racist characterizations of Muslims. Rather, my point here is to connect the similarities between race when it is overtly written on the body and when it is not. Engaging constables' responses as racialized is not about extrapolating a universal structure to racism or the expansion of yet another Euro-American conceptual framework. On the contrary, race needs to be untethered from phenotype that masks as biology and Euro-American exceptionalism. What I needed here are multiple genealogies of race, or as David Theo Goldberg and others have called, racisms. The challenge is to rearticulate the relationship between culture and nature so that we are attentive not only to the invidiousness of that which is inscribed on the body, but also cultural discourses that purport to be about nature and heritage. So my purpose over here is to acknowledge that there are discourses of race and racialization that really rely on phenotypic differences. That even though phenotypic differences seem to be about biology, they really are about culture, right? But at the same time, they work in the register of apparently, this kind of apparent phenotypic differences. At the same time, there are other discourses that are about race and racialization that do not work primarily through the register of phenotype, and that they work in the realm of culture, even though culture there is really imputed to be really about biology. So it's this kind of complexity about race and biology that is working in these kind of multiple ways, and my purpose here is to connect them. Hina, how am I doing on time? Should I continue?
Fine.
Fine?
Okay.
So what I have next are two additional pieces that emerge from the discussion with the constables. So this is part 2 of that discussion. The discussion with police constables moves to hijras. Hijras, again, I think given the audience, most of you will be familiar. But hijras are a little bit hard to translate. They're being increasingly translated as transgender, and certainly some hijras will identify now as transgender. But it's a historical cultural category. It's a category of self-identity. People will identify as such. And it tends to be people who are assigned male at birth and who will dress and present as women. Some of them will undergo castration and appendectomy. But that sort of varies. But most importantly, they self-identify with a community of hijras. Remarkably, hijras were openly acknowledged as targets of police violence in both the discussion groups. Seeing them as inherently sexually transgressive, members of the police were open and unapologetic about their attitudes and practices towards hijras in the Delhi area. Many constables said, "They have sex in public places. They do it for money. Rupees 50, rupees 200, 300. They tell me to see for myself near the domestic airport how hijras attract clients and then rob them of their clothes and their money, or fleece them. My interjections that hijras are more often the victims of violence from clients and police were heard but ignored." The constables echoed that this is how hijras are. They emphasized the need for preventive policing, demanding to know what hijras are doing, keeping an eye on them as troublemakers, and using violence as necessary. Police physical violence against hijras was roundly defended in the interests of public morality. To be a hijra in the eyes of the members of the Delhi police is to be a criminal. The insistent criminalization of hijras by these policemen is a combination of colonial legacies and present-day discourses of sexuality and criminality. Mapping the history of the Criminal Tribes Act, first introduced in the northern provinces in 1871 of the colonial territory, and then throughout British India by 1911, Meena Radhakrishna notes that its underlying purpose was to suppress what were considered hereditary criminal sections of society. The local government was required to maintain a register of the names and residences of eunuchs who might be reasonably suspected of kidnapping, and reasonably, I put within quotes, suspected of kidnapping or castrating children, or might be charged under Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. Arvind Narayan further notes that every aspect of the lives of hijras was criminalized and subject to surveillance and harassment by the police, and that the standard applied was as low as reason to believe, and that is in the code. You know, as long as you have reason to believe, it was fine to stop and treat somebody as a criminal. Which is, that provision made it open to indiscriminate use. The traces of colonial discourses of hijras as inherently transgressive and criminal persist even though hijras were eventually denotified as a criminal community. What is striking about the responses of Delhi police in the two discussion groups are their sentiments that hijras are imminent criminals, about to steal, harass, solicit sex in public areas, and that they are characteristically so as a group or a community. Even though hijras as hereditary criminals was forged out of the same overarching colonial taxonomic discourses that homogenize people as Muslims, Sikhs, Dalits, and more, They were never part of the registers of communalism, saved entirely for religious cultural differences. So these hijras as a category, as we know it in contemporary India, emerges at the same time as the colonial administrators are really mapping people and classifying groups as Muslim, Hindus, and sort of consolidating those categories in a way that was unusual or out of step with what existed previously. At the same time, they do not fall within the category of communalism. That is reserved entirely for religious sectarian differences. Rather, what seems to be important in the case of hijras are perceptions of a shared and innate tendency toward licentiousness and transgression. Part 3. I asked the constables whether Section 377 should change. Several say unequivocally, sex among men or women is wrong. This is against our culture. They raise concerns. If this is removed, it will increase homosexual behavior. What will happen to the population if everyone is doing unnatural sex, especially in the next 100 years? And this was a little peculiar from a context where, the population is now at 1.2 billion. Okay. But there's more. A constable says that the law should change. Each person has a right to sexual satisfaction. हर एक को sexual satisfaction का अधिकार है. This law is wrong in the case of 2 adults who consent to sex. This law should change. This law should be changed as now we are free from colonialism. There should be a difference between forced and consensual sex. The discussion and disagreement continue. The constables have much to say to the question about the future of Section 377, but they are not of one opinion. Several chorus that sex among men or women is wrong. They use words in Hindi that approximate wrong or unnatural in English to note that there is something wrong or inherently not right about sexual practices among women or men. The same constable who racialized crimes reported under 377 also firmly says that these sexual practices are against our culture. Other constables echo an agreement. The implicit suggestion is that same-sex sexual activity is not accorded a place within our culture, and therefore it must not be permitted by changing the law. But other constables disagree. One constable seated on my left in the 4th row turns to his colleagues who oppose the law to say resolutely that the law is wrong, and when applied to 2 consenting adults, that the law is wrong when applied to 2 consenting adults, and it should therefore change. Invoking the colonial past and the post-colonial present, another constable sees 377 as a burden of colonial history that ought to be removed, making law and culture incompatible. The distinction between consensual and coerced sex turns out to be important for some constables as they consider the possibility of changing 377. The suggestion is that the law should be used to prevent coerced sex, but should not apply to consensual sex. The discussion, the disagreements are lively and last for a while. Perhaps most notable is the constable seated in the 3rd row, also on the left, who says surely that each person has a right to sexual satisfaction. Even though the constable speaks in Hindi, the phrase sexual satisfaction is stated in English. Notwithstanding the constable's social class, the phrase sexual satisfaction allows him to capture the need for sexual gratification or fulfillment that exists in each person. As he says, each person, har ek, has this need or desire for sexual satisfaction. This need or desire is framed within a language of rights, or adhikar in Hindi. The articulations of heteronormativity by state agents in the context of a discussion of 377 are riven with differences. On the future of 377, state agents do not speak with one voice. If the constables who oppose the modification or deletion of the law can be seen as homophobic, then can the views of others who are critical of 377 be read more hopefully? Does the constable's affirmation that each of us has a right to sexual satisfaction signal lessening homophobia, and does it unsettle heteronormative reasoning? But what of queering of racialized minorities, the violence toward Hijras that is comfortably represented in the discussion groups? Two analytical points emerge from the above excerpts. The first has to do with the significance of undoing monolithic theories of the state. And second, expanding our tools of analysis beyond the scope of sexuality to focus on the processes of racialization and genderqueer expressions. To the first point, the political significance of identifying dissonances in views on 377 cannot be understated. The police is neither unitary nor always already homophobic. Starting from the position that state institutions such as the police are solidly and unrelentingly heteronormative, assumes ideological coherency and reimposes material and discursive uniformity onto them. And my point here is that if we see this thing, the state, as always already homophobic, as somehow unrelentingly heteronormative, then the state as an arena of contestation in which change may and does occur is no longer viable. In other words, if the state is already so monolithic, then there is no point, in a sense, of contesting it, of seeking change from it, if it is already so, it's already given in terms of this kind of heteronormative stance, right? This is precisely why. It's precisely in order to the recognition that the state is neither, monolithic, nor is it presumably heteronormative or always already so. That's why you get gender sensitization or the sensitization, other sensitization programs that occur among the police, for example. The point is not that criticism of the repression of non-heteronormative practices is unjustified or that vigilance against police abuse is necessary. It absolutely is. The point instead is to raise the possibility of fractures and inconsistencies in these seemingly monolithic units of the state. Secondly, police responses suggest that state regulation of sexuality is inextricably tied with regimes of racialization and gendering. The underside of Hindu middle-class subject may not be the homosexual or the gay, but rather racialized minority groups and Hijras who are pejoratively gendered. Even though only some racialized minorities identify as queer or desire same-sex sexual contact, entire groups are pejoratively cast as queer. The question I initially posed is about 377 and the kinds of crimes committed under it, but the discussion seamlessly shifts to the who, namely Muslims and Sikhs, according to the constables. Disturbingly, these sentiments are repeated by their seniors and supervisors in the second discussion group, even though the emphasis remains on Muslims and Sikhs are not named in this group. These members of the police are unstinting and unapologetic about their derogatory perceptions and violent actions towards Hijras who are seen as criminal because of their genderqueer expressions. The preventive policing in the form of surveillance and managing Hijras is justified on grounds of public interest and social order. What's also clear across the two excerpts is that more than one subject is being invoked at the edges of normality. Muslims, Sikhs, Hijras are variously being named as those inclined towards sexual perversion in ways that are not openly or implicitly contested in the two group discussions. What does get contested, as expressed in the third excerpt, is the rights-bearing subject. This subject, the one who may be entitled to sexual satisfaction, is contested in ways that Muslims or Hijras are not by members of the discussion groups. Undoubtedly, some constables believe that same-sex consensual sexual practices among adults are wrong or go against the grain of Indian cultural orientation, and they express their dissent accordingly. Becoming increasingly clear across these excerpts, then, is that the subject, who may or may not be emancipated by changes in 377, is not necessarily the same as those who are racialized and pejoratively gendered. Although the focus initially is on Muslims and to an extent Sikhs, by the time the discussion moves to the possibility of changes in 377, the subject, who may or may not be granted the right to act on same-sex desire, no longer seems to be the same, right? So in one sense, even at the end, in the paradox excerpt, they're arguing amongst themselves, and some of them say, no, this law should remain, that same-sex sexuality should be criminalized. But there are others who are clearly disagreeing. So they are willing to contest that. But my point is, when they are talking about hijras, or when in the first instance, when the constable says that this is about Muslims and to some extent Sikhs, nobody contests that, right? So nobody's willing to sort of push back against that. Taken together, the excerpt suggests that while there may be flexibility in the policing of adult consenting same-sex sexual subjects, there is little tractability in the regulation of racialized and pejoratively queered groups. So my last point here is that potentially, even as 377 gets decriminalized, right, and the hold and the concern and the preoccupations with policing same-sex sexualities may hopefully start to wane, what's not clear if the prejudices and the pejorative attitudes that police have toward racial, religious minorities or toward hijras, whether that will change is, even less clear. So with that, I'd like to stop. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for a very rich and very complex analysis of the police and the relation of race and racism. And I'm sure we have many questions. I have a long one myself, but if anybody would jump in first, they are most welcome. Or should I go first? I have a long question.
And I'm also happy to clarify. Some things don't always work as effectively when you're reading out a talk. But I didn't want to rely on sort of, rushing over and all of that. But all to say, if there are sort of big questions that are asking for clarification, they are welcome to.
We have plenty of time to discuss and ask a question, so this is great. I have this question about the projecting of recasted images of these particular groups, i.e. the Muslim, the Sikh, the Hijra. And are you arguing that this is a kind of a precondition for the state to perpetually reconstitute itself as a sovereign state, even though it's open for contestations in almost like Klaus Offe sense? I was thinking of Klaus Offe and the incorporation of the contestations eventually over time, and how do you look at that? That was the first part of my question. My second part refers to Rina Das's notion of poisonous knowledge. Mm-hmm. Would you think that that notion applies to these groups which are kind of, would you describe as becoming outsiders within the state and the collective? Would that apply as an experience, that notion, which has, it has been debated, this idea of poisonous knowledge? Mm-hmm. So.
Thank you so much, Helen, for both those questions. So in one sense, so my entry point, right, is questions of sexuality and this whole struggle to decriminalize. And at the same time, what I want to be able to show, because I think the data shows that, the research, the ethnography shows that, is that sexuality works closely in terms, it sort of correlates, it's tied, it's interwoven, it's imbricated with questions of gender, with social class, and here in terms of the realm of religion with issues of racialization also. So to me it's not surprising that if I'm arguing, and as I am, and I believe I can sort of demonstrate that sexuality is working to help constitute the state. This idea of this sovereign state, even thinking about the work of people like Akhil Gupta and James Ferguson, this idea of the state that exists over and above, it's this container that contains society and it overarches, it sort of, exists above society. That very premise of it, that all of that imagination of the state, the discursiveness of the state, is in fact actively sustained by sexuality. And insofar sexuality cannot be separated from, in this context, from racialization, that is absolutely implicated in it too. And within the U.S. context, I don't know if people are aware of the work of David Theo Goldberg, and he has a book called Racial States. So he's making that argument, and he doesn't look at sexuality at all, unfortunately, but he's making an argument in terms of, it's a wide sweeping argument, but he's talking about the way in which race and racialization helps constitute states. And that it's fundamental to the very sort of the premise of it, in a sense that, as you were, so yes, I am in fact making that argument. And I think from within the Indian context, as I know many of you will be aware, this is the piece that is, I don't know, we'll see what the response is, potentially controversial, to really be actively using the grammar of racialization, given that it is so dominated by communalism. And I suppose one last point about it is that I'm not overturning the whole, as if I would, the whole language of communalism. Of course, it sort of matters and there's a whole history around it. But what we haven't done as well is to look at the racial aspects of communalism. So it's to bring those pieces together. And to the second, may I ask for a clarification? Are you talking about police as the outsiders?
No, the groups which they are like demarcating as being outsiders within, the Muslim groups. Which
absolutely.
And according to them are like marginalized groups, and so they should be according to what you have, collected as data.
Yeah, exactly. So that there is a sense of, there's this kind of, for the police, they see them as inclined to criminality, as sort of quote unquote naturally inclined to criminality. And one of the interesting things that I came across as I was doing the research and even looking at some of the case law in this area is that there is this discourse of habituality that is related to sexuality and criminality. And so there is a sense that what keeps coming up is that not only are certain groups in that sense, inclined to criminal activity, but that there's a kind of habitualness to it. That they are just, they do it by habit, and that they're going to continue to do it. That kept coming up.
And would you say that the experience is, for this particular group, is an experience which is to compare with Veena Das's notion of person's knowledge?
I guess I don't want to make claims on, given that my focus was on the police, that what I'm eliciting are, the police narratives, and that's sort of, that I want to trouble. But, I think I would agree with where you're pointing me toward. Yes.
Okay, so let's open the floor for more comments and discussion. Sarah?
If no one else is ready with their question, I have two questions. One is more of a basic, because of the talk you haven't been able to go through everything. But you were talking about the other laws that have more impact.
Sure.
Could you explain what you mean there? Which other laws that might have more, that are having more impact on the situation of sexual minorities?
Yeah. So I think, thank you for the question. So The whole struggle came to be around 377 because it's the Antisodomy Law and it's symbolic and all of that. And in one sense that's understandable given that history, and as I was saying, even though it's not used as much, or we don't see it show up as much in the higher courts, but there is a sense that it is being used as a form of threat, on the streets, and also, has a symbolic presence, right? At the same time, in a real sort of, in a kind of lived way, in a way that impacts the day-to-day lives of people, it's not 377 because the bar to book somebody under 377 or to charge them under 377 is actually higher because you have to take them for a medical examination. It's more complicated. What actually is impacting sexual minorities on the street, and this is where the class issue comes in, right? It's working class people who do not have the protections of privilege and so on and so forth. What is impacting them are vagrancy laws, public nuisance laws, the law related to trafficking, to prostitution. Those are the laws that they are being booked under. And in fact, out of all three of them, primarily, it's the anti-trafficking, the anti-prostitution law that they are being impacted. And that is not even in the purview, as this struggle is. So even, hopefully, it's a matter of time, and hopefully the law 377 will be removed, will be deleted. That is important. But in a practical sense, in terms of certain kinds of subjects, they're actually being impacted by a host of other laws. That is not even on the horizon as far as lesbian, gay, bisexual activism is concerned.
So with those laws, then there's also clearly an element of poverty that's quite important with pregnancy and other things. And then the second part of my question, which is probably too big to ask, thank you for answering the first part, and I really appreciated your lecture, is the main point that you started out with, that states don't just regulate sexuality, but sexuality and the regulation of sexuality constitutes states. Are we talking about a particular historical period of the nation state?
Yes.
That's how you're thinking there. So I don't know if that was really quite a question, but in some senses, that of course goes back to among other people, to Frederick Engels. And are you thinking, and obviously now we're much later in different theoretical period of time, so I don't think that you're derivative in any way, but are there parallels? I'm thinking of this, because that's a real gender feminist question, and of course a queer question as well. This control of sexuality as leading to the constitution of the state. Is that what you're arguing?
Yes, and again, thank you for that. That's precisely what I'm arguing, and for me, the sort of the marker in terms of states and nations really begins with the colonial period. So I'm talking about the modern, and I'm hesitating around the language because, initially what we get within the Indian context is the formation of the colonial state.
Yes.
Right, and sort of, gradually emerging forms of anti-colonial nationalism. And which then morph eventually into the post-colonial nationalism, the constitution of the post-colonial state, and this sort of merging of the post-colonial state and post-colonial nationalism, a certain kind of nationalism. So in that 200-year period, approximately, that's really the period. And right from the, when you look at, so in one sense, it helps me think about a lot of that feminist work that came out, which is around colonial state policies and the way in which the regulation of sexuality was always crucial to that, right? The introduction of this very law, when the law gets reformed, the penal code gets introduced in 1860, the fact that this anti-sodomy law and other laws related to bodily and bodily harm are introduced at the time. So that this kind of preoccupation with sexuality seems to me to be a marker, a hallmark of the sort of the emergence of what we recognize as the modern state.
Well, that's a fascinating argument.
And if you have more thoughts about it, I would love to hear it.
I think it's a well, I mean, of course you get into, well, it wakes a lot of questions, but I don't think I really have commented this time. But it's a very, I think it awakens very fruitful and provocative questions. So I'll look forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
Thank you for that talk. Taking off from what we were just talking about with the 377, I wonder therefore if the LGBTQ movement in India, and is this a criticism wherein they position symbolically the right to legitimacy through 377, which now that you point out is actually, I mean, shouldn't the movement be focusing more for legitimacy in concrete terms of legitimacy rather than symbolically positioning 377 as that right, and not looking at the other laws, which again brings in the class aspect of MSMs and Hijras, and especially many lesbian women who do not become part of the movement in that sense. So can this be positioned as a critique? And also, what are your thoughts about actually going out and seeking legitimacy from the state and society?
Yeah, no, those are very good, good questions, good thoughts, good questions. So, so in a sense, yeah, the part of what I end up doing, the position I end up taking in this book is that, in one sense, so I would say two broad things. Yeah? So how this happens initially is NAS Foundation, which is this HIV/AIDS group based in Delhi. It's an organization, and they filed this writ in Delhi High Court. And I know some of you are going to, hopefully, or everybody's going to be at Maria's, so Maria's going to, or I'm going to talk on, I'm going to present that part, right? So, it starts in 2001. And at the time, what happens is NAS actually, and Lawyers Collective, which is the group that is representing them, they don't consult with a lot of groups. And they're sort of acting, they consult with a few, but it's not widely known at the time, and they introduced this. As the information, and I started my fieldwork in 2002, and a bulk of it happened in 2003. And in a few cases, the groups were hearing, as I was talking to groups around the country, they were hearing about that through me. So the word hadn't really gotten around. And the reason I think this is important, that once the word gets around, as it starts to get around, there's a lot of criticism of NAS. And the fact that they are filing this writ, they filed the writ against the anti-sodomy law, because people are saying that this impacts everybody, all of the constituents, and that they're acting on their own. They haven't widely consulted, which they should have, and it's true, they didn't do a lot of it. Feminist queer groups in particular are very critical because they know the feminist critiques of seeking change through law, that it's always limited, it's always problematic, because you have to work on terrain of the state. You're already engaging the state on its own terms. So they were very critical of it. So all of that criticism it existed, it did not come out into the public. People didn't make it public, but it was behind the scenes. In 2003, the tide turns. And that happened because the government finally filed its response in Delhi High Court. And that response was, sort of, on the one hand, homophobic, right, very predictable. On the other hand, it was actually conciliatory. They were, so the government's response was, yes, it'll, flood gates of delinquency and all of that. But on the other hand, we sort of, the courts apply this within a modern sense. They use contemporary standards. In other words, what the government response was saying, we don't want this decriminalized, but on the other hand, we don't really use it, right? So it was this kind of paradoxical response. And so, but what that did was it turned everything, and all of the criticism kind of fell back to the background, and all of the groups rallied behind Naz. And what also changed is the attention from the media. After 2003, the media, the English language media in particular, were covering this very extensively. And so all the criticism disappeared, and 377 became the rallying point. And then as this progressed, what happened actually was 2004, Delhi High Court turned it down. And then the groups then came together, and they consulted, and then together they appealed to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court told Delhi High Court, no, you better look at this again, treat it on its merits. So it came back. So by the time it came back in 2006, the whole landscape had changed. And it really, it became a national movement by 2006. So, yeah. And the other thing I would say also is 2006, Voices Against 377, the Delhi-based group, they entered a friendly writ. And theirs was much more critical. So they, first of all, it came from a more critical group of people that, were, I think, a little bit more thoughtful about how they framed it. And they did not, it did not suffer from the same limitations as the Naz writ did originally. So in a sense, the movement evolved also. It changed and it shifted. But some of the problems around privacy, the class issue, those have remained. And so therefore, they had to continue with the track that they were already on. They couldn't change track at that point, and so the criticism very systematically stayed with 377. So they did not bring up the vagrancy stuff, the public nuisance, and particularly, really, it's the anti-trafficking, the ITPA, which really stands to most people who are identified as MSM, Gopi, Hijras are really being impacted by that process.
I have another question.
Sure, go ahead.
You've also been talking about race, and I'm thinking whether sex, the act of sexual intimacy itself, and the choice to be of a particular, again, choice is a loaded term now, whether it can be configured completely in biology itself, because this is also important in the sense in which how many LGBTQ communities identify themselves as born this way. And there are many others who would also say that this is choice, especially bisexuals, maybe not, but I've met many. So it's, how do we position sexual intimacy itself within this conversation where race itself, we're relooking race, thanks to a lot of conversation going on. So how would you position the physical act of sex itself?
I think it's an interesting question. In some ways, I guess the issue is how is it sort of, how does it play out culturally and discursively, right? So in one sense, I'm already answering the question that how we think about sex or the physical act of sex is always inherently within a cultural historical framework. If you think about same-sex sexuality, and I try to use that terminology as opposed to homosexuality for a variety of reasons, but if same-sex sexuality, historically, culturally within the Indian subcontinent, most of it's not to say that it's not happening between people who are peers, but most of the evidence that we have is that it's happening, between nobility and people that they have access to, right? That it's a right of privilege, right? And it's no different in that sense than heterosexuality, which is also a right of privilege, right? So the point that I'm getting at is that each cultural moment, setting, has its own sort of discursive imperatives, right? And so if you look at the other context that I know best, in the United States, there is a really interesting moment in which there is this kind of emerging, kind of pushback against this idea that we are born this way, right? That there's a pushback because there are limitations of that we are born this way argument that are coming more and more to the forefront.
Right.
Again, so going back to the Indian setting, what I would say is that there's a slipperiness about it. So in terms of gender, right, in terms of gender difference or anormative, in terms of gender minorities, in terms of hijras and people of similar expression, I think the predominant discourse is that they're born this way, right? That the biology of it is very, very clear. I'm not sure that biological imperative actually exists in terms of sexuality, precisely for the reasons that I mentioned, right? That because it exists and interfaces with social class, this idea that somehow it's Muslims, that there's this kind of cultural biological argument, right? So it's harder to pin down within the kind of cultural framework in terms of sexuality. Sorry, did I say that? It's harder to pin down in the biological framework in terms of sexuality.
I wasn't sure, but when you pointed me, maybe I will ask the question. I was thinking about your. I was thinking because I find it really interesting, and I'm not not many of you know a lot about India. This is not me, but I work on racism, and this is the argument that I'm still struggling. Your argument using the framework of racism in India, and I think the part of it that I'm still doubting about is not about biology and culture, because I think this is quite accepted that the racism is not only about biology, but what does it mean to transfer this kind of analytical framing to another context, and what are we risking at losing the historical context of it? Because you've mentioned the idea that there is when we talk about racism in the Indian context, it's about the colonial and the white and brown and this dynamic. Do you think there's a risk that something is lost, the historical specificity of the relations between different groups in India when we use this concept instead of communitarism?
Thank you for the question. Tell me, what setting do you work on?
I work in Sweden, but also in Europe and Poland. So in different European races.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So the historical specificity question, I really think it's a very important question, and I thank you for raising it. So how I would look at it is in the following way, right? So when we talk about, so in one sense when we talk about race in the Indian subcontinent, immediately all of the conversations are about colonial India. Yes, there's very little. There are actually, I think, a handful of us who are talking about race and racialization in contemporary time. And I've cited all of them. I mean, it's very small in that sense, right? So that if you were to introduce the question of race within the Indian subcontinent, it would automatically be in terms of colonial India, Europeans and brown. That's sort of the figuring. But the reason we figure it that way is because we understand it, we as in sort of collectively, broadly, we understand race in a very particular way. And in that sense, race is being understood as phenotypic, biologically based differences. Even though we would acknowledge and are different as critical scholars of race, right, and I would consider myself one of them, is that as a critical scholar of race, we would say, no, race does not exist in the biological realm. It is a cultural production, right? But at the same time, in a very practical sense, we're so quick to assume that race works only when we see these kinds of phenotypic differences, right? And therefore, this kind of return to Europeans versus brown people there. But if we start to rethink that ontology, right, that we've in fact imposed, that we are sort of reintroduced, if we start to rethink that ontology, then the question becomes, what are the multiple ontologies of race? What counts, what makes something race or about racialness? And the argument, the position that I'm taking is that what makes something about race or racialness is when difference is seen as natural and inheritable. So every time we have difference that is seen as natural and inheritable, that is a form of race or racialization. And so therefore, then I can talk about this kind of racialization, that exists, particularly of the religious minorities, right? So, initially when I was presenting some sort of versions of this talk, when I was starting up my work, in the one presentation in the US, somebody, a sort of very well-known US feminist, says to me, how come you're using race and racialization? You folks don't look different. It's like, yes, I know. But if you're going to make that argument, think about your assumptions, right? In other words, you're making the assumption that it's only about phenotype, which is actually, you have to be able to see it. It's about skin color, it's about hair, etc., etc. And interestingly enough, an Indian feminist took the exact same position, saying, no, it doesn't work because, we don't have those kinds of differences, that we see in Europe or in the United States. But the point is, how are we going to make sense of these differences that are transmissible? And my point is that this is about race and that we need to complicate our theories of race and racialization. That we've got a very particular understanding of race and racialization that derives from the United States and Europe. And that's, in an implicit way, that's the thing that I'm pushing back against.
But this is not what I'm reacting, because I actually work on anti-Muslim racism in Sweden, which is very much struggling with a similar thing. Sometimes it's visible, sometimes not.
Sure.
And then anti-Semitism in Poland, which is very much about, although it was biologized, it is still, the difference is the biological difference is not a visible one.
Sure.
But the historical thing about it, when we think about racism, is something that has been developed in a particular time and place with particular dynamics of ideology, which explains what is going on today, how we can see what happens between different groups in the US. Like the slavery is a part of explanation, or the Holocaust in Europe is part of explanation, and the colonial project. Does this not disturb the analysis of what is going on in the room between these police officers talking about relations between Muslims and Sikhs in India? Are there other historical dynamics that maybe are lost?
I don't, this is what happens, and let me know if that answers the question in terms of historical specificity, is that the idea of the idea of the Hindu, as we have come to understand it today, the Muslim, the Sikh, actually emerges in the mid-19th century as a result of colonial administrative policy. And it's in that moment that and it's, the Hindu is emerging, so this idea, it's a peculiar thing, like Hinduism, unlike Islam or Christianity, even those, Islam and Christianity are such incredibly diverse religions, even there, right? So many different sects. But even in Hinduism, which sometimes seems smaller, there isn't a standard notion of Hinduism. And by that, what I mean is, there aren't texts that are agreed upon, right? Or even across the country, in India, there isn't a single holiday that is observed by all Hindus, because there's so much regional variation, right? So what happens by the middle of the 19th century, in a very peculiar way, all of these disparate sects and groups and people living in very different parts of the country are now being categorized as Hindu. And there are some regional ethnic variations. So, the Bengali is being seen as the effeminate, the one in the north is being seen as the more martial, the militant, the stronger. But at the same time, through colonial policy, Muslims, for the most part, and Sikhs in particular, and some specific Hindu groups are being produced in sort of these very, as the warriors, as the protectors, and other, right? So this kind of differentiation is starting to emerge at the time, and it's then backed by resources. So those are the people, Sikhs and Muslims, enter the military, that is being constituted for the first time in large numbers because of the sense that they are naturally able to protect better, right? So over a period of time, by the latter part of the 19th century, the divisions between Hindus and Muslims start to emerge, and with them, some of this kind of language, this grammar of difference, it comes to the forefront. By the early 20th century, it's in place. By the 1920s, when the Hindu right is actually consolidating itself, that language is very, very firmly in place. And also you're starting to see the riots, at the time, between Hindu communities, Muslim communities, and the sense of they're different, they're meat eaters, all of that is in place. So in that sense, one can kind of trace this. There is historical continuity there.
Thank you.
Malcolm?
Thank you so much for your talk. And as Mark, I have to confess that I don't have a background on India, so maybe my question will sound stupid and pragmatic.
May I interrupt before you ask the question? I actually, always it's wonderful for me when people work on different contexts, and if you're asking it from that, it really, for me, it's an opportunity, so I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you so much. And I'm wondering what is the behavior of the people targeted by Section 377 in India, and how they live their sexuality, knowing that there is this anti-sodomy law, and especially if they know, as you said at the beginning, that there are just few processes in the courthouse in India at the moment about this.
So it's a very, thank you, it's a big, huge question, right? I mean, sort of to characterize the sexual lives of millions of people, basically. It varies. I think there is a big difference in terms of social class. Urban areas, so depending on, age, right? Again, some of this Maria is going to be talking about. So a lot of that varies. I think the short answer of it would be that much of this activity, continues regardless. It has always continued. What people have to be careful about is to what extent it is visible to the police, for example. And oftentimes police are very tightly interlinked. So if it is working class people who are partly dependent on sex work in order to make a living. So they become targets for police because they have to bribe the police and pay regular. So the police are aware of it, and it sort of goes on under their watch. Other times people have to be careful because to protect themselves from blackmail. So upper class men in particular have to, they have a lot of privacy. They have access to relationships. They have access to clubs. In some cases, particular nights of the week are dedicated to that. So, this can go on, and that, there are private parties and farmhouses and all of that. So they have, that activity goes on. But again, they have to be careful up to a certain point so that, they protect themselves. For women, in some respects, it's almost easier. Because when women are with other women, India is still, to quite a degree, is still a homosocial society. So particularly when women are with other women, there are not a lot of questions asked. If you're sort of taking a flat or an apartment together, if you're living together, not a lot of questions asked. I think more and more people are becoming more aware of this and asking questions in a way that they didn't do prior to this. In some cases in rural areas, there are instances in which women are living with other women and everybody kind of knows, but people kind of sort of ignore it. It's just part of it. So, depending on where you are, urban, rural, your class group, your ethnic group, there's just a tremendous amount of variation.
But it's interesting, these things of visibility, because I think gay people around the world as these things of kind not to be so visible, even if they are accepted, there are no against them, their life, the style of life, or the sexuality. So this is a common thing, so not to be so visible with police and states.
Right. That's right, but at the same time, wanting the right to be able to be visible should they so desire, right? Yeah, and I think there is sort of the Indian context, and this is what I was talking about earlier as well. There is a certain kind of same-sex sexuality, homosexuality has always had a certain kind of presence. And it's in the literature, it's in the poetry, right? It's in some of the sculptures. There's a certain kind of presence, and at the same time, it's had a particular kind of presence. It's about who has access to it, which is changing very much now.
So if I'm so currently, the problem is more the police than the law itself. Is how police perform the law than the law itself, or the effects the law can have in the courthouse.
In a manner of speaking, it is the police, it's the effect that they can have. And to an extent, the law itself is the problem too, right? Because one of the arguments that has been made in terms of why that law 377 needs to change is that, if you are a gay couple and you have an apartment, right, and your landlord is not aware of your sexual orientation, and your landlord becomes aware, and once he does, he throws you out. You have absolutely no protection against discrimination, nothing. Not from your workplace, not from social life. You can be disowned by your family, right? All of these. So there are no protections in place. And the argument is that insofar as there is an anti-sodomy law, you can't introduce legislations or policies to protect against discrimination. So even though, in one sense, even though the law is not being used, it still needs to go. But in a day-to-day sense, it is. The police are really at the threshold of law and people's lives, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for a fantastic presentation. I really like the way you sort of pointed out how the state is not monolithic and is not sort of heteronormative per se, and I think it's very smart to go to the agents of the state instead of looking at legislation, because that creates a very sort of black and white picture. South Africa is gay friendly, Uganda is homophobic, etc. And then it's really a question of historical change also, which can happen really quickly. I mean, when Obama became president, he was against sort of gay marriage, and now it's kind of another situation in the States, to mention another country. But I was wondering about the sort of, because it was clear to me that when you said that the police were sort of discussing or negotiating their stand towards the anti-gay or the sodomy law, let's say. That was one thing, and then they were really very sort of, they agreed very much about not sort of including hijras in their acceptance then, which seems to me to be very much a class question also, because I mean gays and lesbians, they do have access to sort of funds and so on. And how visible and how important is the gay movement in India to sort of influence like the views of, say, police agents and so on, and to sort of create change on that level?
to some degree, I mean, this has been going on for a while. This is under the auspices of the HIV/AIDS sensitization programs, but police have been in a number of places, at least in the big cities. Not so much, I think, in the second-tier cities or second, third-tier cities or the more rural areas. But in the larger metropolises, there have been desensitization programs that have been in place. So I think they have been having some impact, probably not a whole lot, and in part because of sort of homophobic attitudes, and in part because of the very structure of policing. And the structure of policing is such, and again, the foundations for this were laid within the colonial period. The structure of policing is such that there is an adversarial relationship between police and the people they police. Because the people who are policed, and even when you're, let's say, middle class, but particularly when you are somebody who's indigent or working class, that part of the police income for very arduous work, I mean, the constables have a miserable life. There's no question about it. Work life, that is. They're working long hours. Technically, they're on the job 7 days a week. Even when they're, they have a day off, they can be called back at any moment. And they're oftentimes doing these sort of long hours protecting politicians, particularly in a place like Delhi, which is a capital, protecting politicians. So they have an adversarial relationship in the sense that part of their income is going to come from these communities, right? Or even the sort of the middle class gay person that they sort of, I'm going to threaten to pay off, otherwise I'm going to tell your parents or I'll book you, or, et cetera, et cetera. So in that context,